The first snows settled light and scattered, dusting the tall grass near the trail sign. Thin patches clung to the crushed stone path, barely holding on, but it was enough to mark the turn of the season. We parked off the narrow Forest Service road beside the empty lot and stepped out into air cold enough to scrape the back of the throat. There was no wind yet. Cold settled over everything, quiet and still, a warning spoken without sound. Levi kicked the truck doors shut with a boot and stood staring up at the ridge while I finished lashing the last canvas duffel into my pack frame. The trail sign was half faded, warped from years of sun and snow melt, the Forest Service logo flaked to bone white. I checked the logbook tucked in the weatherproof metal box and flipped back a few pages. Only 5 or 6 entries since September. One of them had been crossed out so hard the cardboard backboard was dented beneath it. Below that, someone had rewritten the same name in tight block lettering with a note, Trail incomplete. Camp north of Basin. Left early. I signed us in without comment. The hike started slow. The first stretch followed the Beckler River through a corridor of evergreens tall and thin, their trunks straight and rigid, sharp against the frost-hard soil. The path twisted through old thermal runoff zones, and every so often, steam would rise in little gusts from fissures in the earth, sour-smelling and alive. Birds were scarce. We saw no elk, no bison, not even scat. Just the winding brown water of the river and the skeletal trees edging the bank. We passed the boiling terraces by mid-afternoon. They were smaller than I'd pictured, maybe a dozen shallow steps of pale mineral buildup, each one brimming with bubbling water too hot for even the algae to survive. Steam hung low over the terraces, forming a pale ceiling that hid the upper ridge where the old crow markers were supposed to be. I'd read about them once, stones placed in a line hundreds of years ago to warn travelers not to pass through during the cold months. Most were lost now. Levi stopped to adjust his bootlaces, glanced up at the terrace, and muttered something I didn't quite catch. I didn't ask him to repeat it. By the time we made camp, the last light was going, and the clouds had thickened into a pale gray ceiling that dulled everything down to a flat, hushed silence. We strung up the bear hang and got the stove going just in time to eat in the blue hour. Levi turned in early. I stayed up with the notebook, watching the dark creep in from behind the ridge. Somewhere distant, maybe a mile off, maybe more, something let out a sound I couldn't place. Not quite a howl. Not quite a whistle. It didn't rise and fall like a wolf, didn't echo like an elk bugle. It just carried, slow, steady, and wide, moving through the trees without touching them. I kept writing. Didn't mention it. Figured Levi had already fallen asleep. The next day, the trail split near a thermal basin we'd flagged on the map. Levi wanted to swing around west, follow the high route through the basalt outcrops. I preferred to stick lower, less exposure, more cover. We compromised and kept to the central spine, hugging the valley between. That's where we saw the elk carcass. It wasn't fresh. The snow around it had melted and refrozen. What was strange wasn't the body, it was the way the bones had been arranged. The larger limbs had been stripped clean and placed outward from the ribcage in a spiral pattern. The skull was missing entirely. No scavenger signs. No claw marks or coyote tracks. Just the frozen imprint of a circle in the snow, and the pale shine of bare bone under a gray sky. Levi stood over it for a long minute. Then he walked on without a word. We didn't talk about it that night either. The third day, we reached the outer basin. The trees thinned near the geothermal field, and the ground turned to a crusted mix of mineral and dead lichen that broke underfoot like old coral. Steam jetted from cracks in the stone every few minutes, sharp and wet, stinking of sulfur. We crossed the basin as the sun began to drop, heads down, eyes on the map trail markers. Halfway across I felt it. It wasn't a sound. Not really. More a sensation, like a weight turned its attention toward us. The vent gurgled every few minutes, sounding like a throat clearing. Levi paused just ahead, one boot sunk into a shallow crust hole, then looked up. We both saw it at the same time. At the far edge of the basin, just beyond the rise of steam, stood a shape. Tall. Upright. Motionless. The air shimmered around it. It could have been a standing tree, thin and barkless, but the shape held no natural curves. Then it stepped back, vanishing behind a vent plume without a sound. We didn't speak. We just kept walking. That night, the frost crept thicker along the tent fabric. I left the stove cold and kept the notebook open longer than I needed to. My dreams were brittle and thin, full of footsteps where no ground should be. A cold too deep to breathe through. Something old pressing its hands just above the surface of the earth, waiting to break through. By morning, the frost had left circular patterns across the gear. Spirals, faint and wide, as though something had leaned close and breathed a memory into the nylon. I shook them off. We packed and moved fast. We had 6 more days ahead of us, ridge passes, a planned descent into one of the thermal river valleys, a loop back along the southern corridor before pickup. But I already knew something was wrong. Not in the obvious sense. The sun still rose. The stove still lit. Our boots still followed a trail that hadn't yet disappeared. But the birds didn't return. The silence deepened. And Levi was quieter than usual. Too quiet, even for him. That was when I found the old cairn. It was half buried under a slew of fallen rock near a bend in the trail, just past a steam vent that gurgled every few minutes with a sound like a throat clearing. The pile had been carefully placed, stacked stone with flat sides, slate mostly, dry laid in a rough pyramid. At some point, part of the upper slope had given out, dislodging the top layer. When I brushed a few stones aside to check the integrity, the ground gave a little under my boot. Underneath was bone. Several pieces, human or close enough I didn't want to keep digging. One was a jaw. Another had the curled shape of a deer's leg. But they were fused together, not melted, not broken and stacked, but grown. As though they'd been part of the same thing once. I backed off slowly and didn't say a word to Levi. Later that night, I found something wedged inside a burnt-out stump near our camp. Folded twice and sealed under a stone. A weather-beaten corner of a Forest Service incident report. The pages were charred, water-stained, torn, but I could still make out a few lines. Unauthorized cairn disturbance. Collapse recorded. Recommend full survey of cave network. Cultural sensitivity warning, crow advisory walking bone father. The words itched. I folded the page and slid it into the back of my notebook without telling Levi. The wind picked up. We didn't speak until morning. I don't remember if I dreamed that night, but I woke with the taste of ash in my mouth and the feeling that something had stood nearby while I slept, watching the tent breathe. And we were only halfway in. The morning light cut sharp through the dense pines as I pulled the tent flap aside. Frost clung to the edges of the canvas, sparkling faintly beneath the pale sun. Levi was already moving, boots crunching over the thin snow crust that coated the forest floor. We packed fast, the cold biting through gloves and jackets alike. The air smelled faintly of pine and sulfur, carried on a stillness that felt heavier than the chill. Around us, the trees stood straight and silent, their needles dusted white where last night's snow had settled but never melted. The trail ahead led us toward Heart Lake, winding through a landscape shaped by steam and stone. Patches of mineral deposits cracked the earth beneath footfalls, colored in rust and ochre by the heat bubbling just beneath the surface. We skirted boiling springs where the ground hissed and spat, rising steam curling in thin plumes like breath caught in the cold. The smell stung at the back of my throat, sharp and rotten, the unmistakable odor of sulfur drifting from vents hidden beneath a crust of ice. Birdsong was absent, the usual chatter of chickadees or the rattle of woodpeckers replaced by an unnerving silence. Tracks in the snow grew fewer as we moved deeper into the basin, no sign of rabbits or squirrels, and the great elk herds that normally grazed here had vanished. Even Levi's steps slowed, boots brushing lightly over frozen moss and brittle twigs, eyes flicking to the shadows where the trees thinned. I kept my gaze fixed on the trail markers, a thin ribbon of paint on cracked bark, but I could feel the weight of something watching in the quiet between footsteps. By midday, we reached the edge of a small outpost, a weathered ranger cabin half swallowed by moss and frost. Its peeling green paint cracked beneath layers of ice, the windows dull and opaque with condensation. We slipped inside, the wooden floor groaning beneath boots as Levi checked the survey equipment scattered across a folding table. I moved to a faded map pinned nearby, notes in looping script marking recent trail closures and geyser activity. The cabin felt empty in a way that pressed against the skin, a stillness that didn't belong. Survey tools lay overturned on the floor, snow tracks led away from the door, some large and uneven, others too strange to place, dragging scars gouged through the frost and pine needles like claws raking a surface raw. The radio lay dead on the bench, its screen cracked and black. I pressed buttons, static snapping in my ear but no voices answered. Levi's face tightened, the usual easy confidence fading into something sharper, wary. We stepped outside again, the cold sharper in open air, breath steaming between us as a distant growl rolled low through the valley. The sound settled into the ribs like a weight, deep, guttural, not like any animal I'd heard before. It held a steady rhythm beneath the wind, a rough vibration that rattled loose stones at our feet. We froze where we stood, eyes sweeping the tree line. Movement flickered at the edge of a clearing, something tall, too thin to be a tree, but with bark-like skin stretched tight over limbs bent in impossible angles. It stood still, limbs nodding into the snow, head tilted in a way that felt deliberate. Its breath was faint but foul, drifting on the cold air, mixing with the sulfur. The creature's eyes locked with mine, dark, sharp, aware, before it vanished behind a plume of steam, leaving nothing but the sharp snap of broken branches. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for the radio again, fingers numb and shaking. Static hissed in my ear, then silence. Levi's voice cracked over the line, tense and hurried, reporting strange noises near camp, something prowling just out of sight. I told him I was heading back, breaking into a run before the words finished. The forest shifted around me as I moved, branches scraping against jackets, snow crunching unevenly beneath boots. My lungs burned with each breath, cold and heavy, and the sharp sting of sulfur filled my nostrils. Behind me, low scraping noises echoed, slow and methodical, scraping over frozen earth and dry brush. I dared not look back, feet pounding the frozen ground as the clearing opened into ridge-line views tinted with dusk. The camp appeared just as the clouds swallowed the sun, shadows folding over tents and gear. Snowflakes began to fall, fine and cold, carried on a rising wind that tugged at loose straps and flapped fabric. Something lingered beyond the tree line, a presence, unseen but sensed, still and watching as the forest whispered in the dark. I reached the tent, heart still pounding, and readied myself for the night ahead. This was no longer just wilderness. It was something older, something waiting beneath the snow and steam, and it had found us. We'd pushed on until the sun barely touched the ridgeline behind us, our pace steadier than the day before, though either of us said it out loud. Levi stayed a few steps ahead most of the time, silent, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to press through a headwind that didn't exist. By the time we made camp, we were well beyond where the trail turned south. The map called it a transitional zone, mineral flats broken by deadfall and sulfur vents, but that name didn't catch the weight in the air, the way it pressed down once the light went. The stove hissed and clicked as it caught, but neither of us lingered around it. Levi crawled into his bag early, claiming a headache. I stayed up just a little longer, pretending to write, though the pages stayed mostly blank. The quiet was different now. It wasn't the natural hush of isolation. It was something pressed down over the land like a tarp, holding everything in place. No wind. No insects. No distant cracks of ice splitting under thermal stress. When I finally ducked into the tent and zipped the door closed, I left the notebook open beside me. The spiral patterns had returned on the tarp outside, only these were cleaner. Tighter. Like they'd been drawn. Sleep didn't come easily. I listened for Levi's breathing and tried not to count the seconds between it. At some point I drifted. When I woke, there was pressure on the tent wall. Not a weight, exactly. Just a slow, steady push. Like someone was leaning into the fabric with the side of their hand. It slid along the nylon with measured resistance, moving from one pole to the next. I held still. The stove was off. No light. The frost on the inner wall shivered slightly but didn't break. Then it was gone. I lay there for what could have been minutes or hours, heart thudding against my ribs so loud I was sure Levi could hear it. But he didn't stir. Eventually, I sat up and unzipped the flap just enough to look outside. The frost was back, but this time it wasn't just spirals. Across the outer shell of the tent, faint drag lines curved toward the edge of camp. Not claw marks. Not boot prints. More like a stiff branch had been drawn backward across the frost, parting it into thin symmetrical streaks that all pointed to the tree-ling. I stepped out and walked the perimeter slowly, breath tight in my chest. The air had that smell again, sulfur and something beneath it, like wet dust on old stone. Nothing moved. Nothing cracked. Even the steam from the closest vent had calmed. By the gear pile, I found a bone. Small. Clean. Set neatly on top of the folded tarp we'd used for firewood collection. A knuckle joint, deer or small elk maybe, though too smooth, too light for how fresh the kill would have needed to be. I turned in place, scanning the darkness past the last ring of trees. Nothing. But I didn't pocket the bone, either. I left it and went back into the tent. When Levi stirred a little before dawn, I didn't tell him. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked like he hadn't slept either. I didn't ask. We broke camp fast and walked out under a sky still half-colored with the tail end of night. Whatever had come close wasn't done watching, and we weren't far enough from wherever it had started. The land hadn't shifted back. Not yet. We pushed deeper into the ridges that morning, frost still clinging to the folds in our boots and steam rising faintly from our breath. The air was still, the cold carrying that strange hush that made every footstep feel loud. Around us, the trees thinned, older growth, but not tall or majestic. Their trunks were twisted and pale, warped by years of sulfur winds and hard winters. Some leaned over as if dragged by the slope, roots exposed and clinging to white stone. The rest stood brittle and stiff, more like remnants than living trees. Neither of us said much. Levi moved like his mind was elsewhere, always a few paces ahead, never turning back to check if I was following. I let him take the lead. The trail faded in and out of sight, marked only by cairns worn down to flat stacks or small bleached flags of tape caught in branches that hadn't grown in years. By midday, the GPS unit started to lag. Not a full failure, just delays in updating, stuttering along with sudden jumps that didn't match the map overlay. I marked our position on paper anyway, just in case. My compass still held steady, but the ridgelines around us began to feel wrong. Not twisted or misleading. Just too uniform. Every slope ended at the same angle. Every outcrop spaced evenly apart. As though the land had been shaped to a pattern. When we stopped to check the topo, Levi crouched beside me, frowning at the inked contour lines. His breath was faster than it should have been, we hadn't climbed much. The air had gone still again. No birds, no wind, not even steam from the vents. Just that thick pressure like a dome had dropped over the basin. We moved on. The next vent we passed had collapsed in on itself, stone buckled inward and bone ash dusted along the outer rim. I knelt to examine it. Embedded in the crusted mineral was the corner of another paper scrap. I worked it loose with a gloved hand. A Forest Service report page, water damaged and burned like the last. Only 2 legible lines, North Outcrop sealed under tribal supervision. Crow Rights observed. No further entry recommended. Levi didn't wait. He was already climbing the next ridge, head down, boots kicking ash loose with each step. We crested a rise near late afternoon, and came upon a sight that stopped us both. At first glance it looked like a weather station, 6 poles driven into the ground, each strung with faded cloth and bits of bone, forming a wide circular perimeter. In the center sat a broken tent. Forest Service issue. The nylon torn open and half covered in frost. Levi broke the perimeter line without hesitating, stepping across the closest string of bone charms. I hesitated, then followed. The tent was still staked in places. Inside, a pack lay open, gear scattered but not stolen. Maps, field books, empty water bladders. I found a badge wedged in the corner seam, cracked plastic laminate with the Forest Service logo, and a name worn nearly blank. On one page of a field notebook, a scrawl, spirals match cave markings. Pressure fluctuations time to vent cycle. Bonewalker real. It didn't feel like looting. It felt like stepping into the afterimage of someone's last night. The fire pit was cold. A flare casing half buried nearby was still unspent. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't left a mess. Just silence and cold. We didn't camp there. We moved another mile east and set up in the crook of a rock wall that cut the wind. As we worked, Levi's boot caught on something buried under the ash-crusted scree. He brushed it clear. A charred section of spine, likely from a deer, though the shape looked wrong, scorched black and cracked like it had been crushed under immense weight. He nudged it away without speaking. That night, the spirals came back. This time, they weren't just on the gear. They were in the frost patterns climbing the tent wall from the outside. Not drawn or scraped, formed. Perfectly symmetrical, like they'd grown there. I traced one with my finger through the fabric and felt the temperature shift beneath my touch, warmer, for just a second, like heat bleeding from an open mouth. I didn't sleep. I listened. Far off, bones cracked. Not the sharp snap of something breaking, more like tension being worked loose, one joint at a time. I sat up, held my breath, and waited. Nothing followed. Nothing moved behind it. No shift in weight. No trace of breath. Just the distant echo of something old stretching itself awake in the cold. The next morning, Levi didn't eat. He packed quickly and moved like he wanted distance from the night behind us. By mid-morning, the trees vanished altogether. The ground split open into shallow fractures, geothermal vents hissing between sheets of broken stone. In one of the gaps, barely wide enough to fit both shoulders, I saw a flicker. Nothing glowed or shifted. I pulled my headlamp and shone it into the crack. The walls descended straight for at least 20 feet before slanting into shadow. And there, etched into one side, were spirals, wide, uneven, carved deep into the mineral with something harder than steel. Below them, a symbol. A crown of bone. Crossed femurs. Char lines radiating outward. I turned off the beam and stepped back. That afternoon, we found the cave mouth. It was nestled behind a slump of boulders, hidden unless you passed it from the east. The opening was barely shoulder-high, but wide. The rock around it was stained, smoke-washed and streaked with blackened residue like something had tried to burn its way out. Neither of us stepped forward. Levi's face stayed turned slightly away, his hands buried deep in his coat like that might somehow distance him. I didn't want to say it, but I wasn't going in either. We stood like that for a long while, staring into the black. Then a breath of air slipped out, dry, weighty, tinged with something sharp beneath the ash, like the inside of an old furnace long cooled but never truly clean. I marked the entrance on my map but didn't enter. We set camp another half-mile uphill, but I never turned my back to that slope. Not once. We were far from any marked trail now, no signs, no cairns, just broken stone and a silence that stretched too wide to feel empty. Something was down there. Something that had waited long enough to remember how to move again. The snow arrived just after first light, drifting down in thin sheets that settled quickly on the cold stone and brittle branches. The sky was a heavy gray, pressing low against the ridges and dulling every edge. The wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of sulfur and frozen earth as it swept through the skeletal pines. I tightened my pack straps, feeling frost seep through my gloves despite the layers. Levi had been quiet since dawn, eyes flicking to every shadow that moved against the white backdrop. Our route followed a narrow corridor between two steep ridges, a path choked with half-frozen brush and jagged stones. The snow made the footing treacherous, covering loose scree and frozen mud alike, each step a calculated gamble. The air had the metallic tang of a coming storm, and even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Without warning, Levi stopped, a stiff pull on his shoulder telling me to halt. Ahead, the faint outline of a cairn appeared, rough stacked stones, half covered in snow, but something was wrong. The pattern was off, crooked, as if disturbed and hastily rebuilt. Around it, broken branches lay snapped, their sharp edges gleaming wet in the cold light. A low cracking sound drifted up from the brush, slow and heavy, less like twigs snapping than the slow grind of something alive and massive, easing forward through the undergrowth. Levi's hand moved to the sidearm at his hip. I tightened my grip on my pack straps, breath slow and steady despite the sudden drop in temperature pressing on my chest. Then the air shifted. A weight behind the silence, a pressure that settled deep in the bones. The creature stepped into the clearing with a rough scrape of bone on stone, its limbs twisting unnaturally, a patchwork of weathered human and animal bone lashed together with sinew and frayed leather. A broken elk skull rested like a crown atop its head, cracked and stained dark with age. Its hollow sockets held no eyes, only faint glimmers of reflected white snow and swirling fog. It didn't rush. It didn't roar or growl. It watched. Levi's breath caught. He leveled his pistol, fingers tight on the cold metal, but didn't fire. His eyes darted, searching for weakness, for a place to strike. I could feel the pulse in his jaw, tight and unyielding. I dropped my pack slowly, hands raised, not daring to move closer. The wind picked up, carrying the faint hiss of escaping steam from nearby vents, mixing with the bitter cold. The ground beneath us was slick with ice, and the snow around the creature's feet melted oddly, like the heat of its presence was drawing the cold away. It shifted then, limbs jerking as if learning to move again after decades of stillness. The bone clubs it dragged along the ground scraped with a grinding noise, sharp and resonant. The sound cut through the cold air like stone shearing against stone. Without warning, Levi fired. The shot echoed harsh and final, a burst of light that momentarily painted the snow crimson. The beast flinched, its form jerking backward, but did not flee. Instead, it advanced, the elk's skull tilting as if studying us, the crown of bone casting twisted shadows across the snow. I grabbed Levi's arm. Fall back. Move. He hesitated, then started backward, sliding on ice, boots kicking up snow. The stalker followed, moving with a jagged grace, each step a calculated pull and release of limbs that should not bend that way. Behind us, the ridge narrowed into a tight funnel. The trees here were sparse and brittle, their skeletal branches scraping the gray sky. The snow thickened, and my breath fogged in ragged clouds as I forced myself to keep pace, heart hammering in a cadence too loud to ignore. The skeletal horror's breath, or whatever it was, rose in rasping gusts, a sound like dry wind pushing through hollow bone chambers. Its presence bent the space between us, a pressure that cracked my teeth and clenched my gut. We stumbled into the old Crow's Sweat Lodge ruin, half buried in snow and shadow. The stone walls, darkened by soot and age, rose uneven but solid. Inside, the air was still, layered with the scent of dried herbs and something sharp, like crushed pine needles. I pulled a small pouch from my pack, shaking out dried sage leaves, then scattered them in a careful circle around the entrance. Levi stood beside me, pistol ready but eyes wide, the fight leaving his face for the first time. The bone-crowned figure reached the mouth of the lodge, its form paused just outside the threshold, hesitating. The pressure around us thickened, like thickening syrup, and the cold stung at every exposed inch of skin. Then, it let out a howl, not a scream or a roar, but a sound that tore through the air in waves, low and broken, rising and falling with a terrible sorrow. I traced the symbol in ash along the threshold, the ancient etchings I'd copied from the pictographs in the cave, lines crossing in tight spirals, a crown of bones surrounded by steady circles. The creature shifted uneasily, as if the symbol struck a chord deep within its fractured form. Levi gripped my arm. "It won't cross." I didn't answer. The thing snarled and tried to step forward, but the circle held it firm. It hissed, bones grinding and scraping, then lurched back, dragging one club against the stone wall in frustration. The snow picked up suddenly, thick flakes smearing the air and blurring edges. The stalkers circled the lodge, low and methodical, its hollow sockets flickering with an unearthly glow. It reached out with one clawed hand, fingers curling like cracked twigs toward the ash circle, but the ground beneath resisted, a faint shimmer like a hidden barrier. Then it retreated, melting back into the shifting snowfall and bone-white forest, leaving behind a cold stillness so profound it rang in my ears. Levi sagged against the wall, breath ragged, eyes flicking to every shadow beyond the stone. "We can't stay here long." "We don't have a choice," I said. "We need to reach the thermal basin before night." The creature's howl echoed behind us as we moved out, a reminder that it waited, patient and relentless. The trail back was a narrow, twisting path, snow covering any mark of passage. Every step sank into fresh powder, erasing what little we left behind. The forest felt thinner, colder, as if the beast's presence sucked warmth from the air. I glanced over my shoulder once, catching a glimpse of a dark shape slipping between the trees, always just out of clear sight. My breath tightened, lungs burning with effort and fear. Levi stumbled over a hidden root, falling hard onto the snow. The impact cracked through the quiet. The creature surged forward, seizing the moment. I lunged, grabbing Levi's arm, pulling him up as the bone-crowned figure raised a jagged club overhead. We ran then, muscles screaming, lungs heaving. The wind slammed into us, carrying the sharp, sulphurous stench of the geothermal vents. The ground shuddered beneath pounding feet and distant rumbles, the mountain's slow warning. Ahead, steam rose in thick clouds from fissures cracked wide by frost. I forced myself to keep moving, vision blurring, heart pounding, the stalker close behind. The last burst of daylight caught the beast silhouetted against the steam, its crown of bone raised high like a terrible beacon. It swung the club in a wide arc, smashing the ground where we'd stood moments before. The earth cracked, snow exploding in frozen shards. We dove behind a rock outcrop, gasping, pressing close to the cold stone as the creature's heavy steps thudded past, missing us by inches. The air turned sharp and bitter. I grabbed a handful of dry pine needles and crushed them between my fingers, the scent burning my nose. I remembered the old ranger's warning about sacred ground and rivers. "Levi, the river!" I gasped. "It can't cross." He nodded, struggling to stand. We sprinted toward the faint sound of rushing water, the snow now a blur against our faces. The river was swollen, ice cracked and jagged along the edges, rushing fast beneath a thin sheet of clear water. I stepped in, cold biting through my boots and socks. The creature skidded to a halt at the opposite bank, tilting its skull crown, snarling in frustration. We didn't stop. Pushing through snow and cold, we put distance between ourselves and the bone-wrapped nightmare waiting across the water. Levi fell behind near the tree line. I looked back. He waved weakly, chest heaving, then disappeared beneath a fallen tree's shadow. I called for him, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. Alone, I kept running, heart pounding, lungs burning, breath ragged as the storm closed in. The creature's howl faded but didn't vanish. It was waiting. The storm never broke. It chased me through the trees like a living thing, flaying my skin with wind and choking every breath with snow. I'd crossed the river the night before, barely, and now the world was white, silent, and closing in. I moved with numb legs and a mind worn flat from fear. Behind me, nothing stirred, but I didn't trust the quiet. The creature had stopped at the riverbank, but it hadn't turned back. I remembered its eyes tracking me through the trees. It wasn't gone. It was looking for another way around. I climbed a narrow slope toward the geothermal basin, where the old ranger's map had pointed. Somewhere ahead was the shrine. The last real place left. My fingers ached, my boots were soaked, and my lungs were raw by the time I crested a rise and looked down into a half-buried clearing. Vents hissed up from cracks in the earth. The snow didn't stay here, it melted in wide, wet circles, revealing black rock and bones beneath. At the center stood the shrine, a ring of split stones, arranged like teeth around a pit of ash. The markings on the stone matched the journal, the same spirals, the same crown-like etching. I stumbled forward, falling to one knee, then dragging myself into the center. The wind died. I scattered the last of my sage. My hands bled from the cold, and I had no lighter, only half a matchbook tucked into the pages of my notebook. I struck one. It fizzled, caught, and I lit the sage. Smoke spiraled into the heavy air. Then I heard it. Behind me. I turned just as it stepped into view from the mist, closer than I expected, its frame massive, shoulders hunched and uneven. It had crossed the river. The Bonewalker was cracked now, visibly splintered from our last encounter. One leg dragged, and strips of hide hung from its ribs. But it hadn't slowed. Its elk skull crown was still in place, and its bone clubs scraped twin trenches through the slush. It growled low, a sound of recognition. I backed into the center of the shrine, brandishing my knife and holding what little flame I had. My rifle was gone. Lost somewhere in the snow hours ago. All I had left was the ash, the sage, and the hope that whatever this place was, it would hold. The creature circled. Its breath steamed out in thick bursts. Its limbs twitched unnaturally, sometimes bending in directions that broke logic. I held my ground. It stepped over the first stone. The flame in my hand flared. The creature hissed and jerked back. The smoke curled upward into its face, and it reeled as if struck. I grabbed another match, lit more sage through the burning herbs directly at its feet. It screamed. A high, rattling shriek that shook the trees. The bones in its chest shifted, as if something inside was trying to escape. Its claws dug at the earth, and it surged forward again, this time crashing against the circle, swiping one massive arm at me. I ducked. The swing missed my head by inches and shattered a standing stone. The air pulsed, whatever protection the shrine gave was faltering. Desperate, I tore the journal page from my coat, opened it with frozen fingers, and slammed my palm down on the symbol drawn there, the same crown, the same spiral. The Bonewalker froze. It twitched. Then began to howl, no longer rage, but panic. Its clubs dropped. Its legs buckled. Steam poured from its joints. The snow beneath it turned black. It tried to back away, but its limbs wouldn't obey. It collapsed just outside the circle, twitching violently. I remained still, kneeling with my hand pressed against the paper, smoke curling gently around me, until the creature finally stilled. The storm began to fade, not vanish, but thin, as if something had exhaled. Slowly I rose to my feet. Every muscle ached, and my sleeve was soaked with blood. I stared at the twisted heap of bone and leather collapsed in the snow. It lay motionless. Without a word, I turned away from the shrine, not daring to look back. The morning broke slowly, pale and brittle beneath the sky weighed down with lingering gray clouds. The storm that had battered the forest for days finally eased, leaving behind a stillness so complete it almost felt unnatural. I stayed close to the stone circle, the ash glowing faintly where the dawn light caught it, a fragile barrier between me and whatever waited beyond. Levi was gone. That truth echoed in my mind with every breath, a cold ache deeper than the frost biting my cheeks. But giving up wasn't an option. Not now. Not after everything that had come before. I moved carefully, boots crunching through the hard crust of snow as I traced the path the creature had taken before retreating. My fingers brushed over the symbols etched into the stones, circles and spirals, and that terrible crown of bone that haunted my dreams. These ancient marks held power, a warning from long ago. The river lay ahead, dark and swift beneath a thin veil of cracked ice, steam rising from its heated vents in lazy, curling wisps. I knelt at the bank, dipping a gloved hand into the icy water, feeling its chill bite through layers of clothing. This was the sacred boundary, the final seal keeping the Bone King chained to his cursed domain. As I gazed upstream, a shadow flickered among the skeletal pines. For a moment, my heart seized, but the forest was still. The ghost of the creature's presence seemed to fade with the storm's passing. Opening the worn journal again, I read aloud the faded, smudged words. They spoke of an ancient guardian bound by rituals now nearly forgotten, a being shaped by pain and betrayal, its fury born of broken promises and a land scarred by greed. I thought about Levi, his steady hands, his wary eyes, the quiet strength he carried even when fear threatened to unravel him. He had vanished in this wild, unforgiving place, swallowed by shadows I barely understood. The forest had taken something from me. But it had also given me something, a knowledge older than the mountains themselves, a chance to restore balance. I set to work restoring the shrine. My fingers numbed as I scraped fresh ash into the circle, recarved the symbols with broken stones, and scattered sage and crushed pine needles over the frozen earth. Each movement was a prayer, a plea for forgiveness and protection. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on my chest all week seemed to lighten, the air around me growing less sharp, less hostile. As dusk bled into night, I lit a fire in the heart of the circle. The flames danced, throwing flickering shadows against the ancient stones. I sat close, wrapping my arms around my knees, letting exhaustion seep into my bones. The forest whispered around me, the sound neither threat nor comfort. Somewhere far off, the faint, mournful howl of the Bone King echoed, not a challenge this time, but a sorrowful lament carried on the wind. Sleep came slowly, fragmented by dreams of bone and fire, of rivers running red beneath cold stars. When I awoke, the first light was just brushing the highest ridges, spilling soft gold across the frost-laden trees. I stepped outside the circle, breath catching at the cold, clear silence. The world seemed different, lighter, but still ancient and vast. I knew the curse had not been lifted entirely. The Bone King still roamed, bound but restless, a shadow of the land's forgotten past. But the balance held. For now. I gathered my gear and looked once more toward the forest, where the trees swayed gently in the morning breeze. The story was not over, not truly. But I had survived. And that was enough.